Hello. So in this video, I'm going to talk about metaethics. I will describe metaethics, like what that actually is, in just a little bit more detail later on. But whenever you put meta in front of something, that means you're talking sort of at a higher level about that topic. So rather than talking about any particular issues or problems in ethics or working through some kind of decision making having to do with ethics, this is talking about ethics itself. What is it? Where does it come from? So just a couple of terms to establish as we start here. Very often we tend to use these terms, morality and ethics, kind of interchangeably, but morality is what people are referring to when they're talking about sort of your specific personal behavior. In particular, how are you interacting with other people? Are you helping them? Are you harming them? So, how do other people think of you in that way? Whereas ethics is sort of more broad. It includes morality, but sort of everything about how you should be living your life. And it could even include sort of professional ethics. So, for example, there's legal ethics for lawyers or business ethics for business people. So anyway, moving on. There we go. Metaethics, we got to start off with just what is ethics in general. And one of the difficulties with ethics is that it's distinct from any physical facts. So physical facts, we can gather those through basic empirical investigation. That is investigation using our sensory systems. Whereas ethical judgments are not immediately observable. These are judgments that we make based on the physical facts. So physical facts, of course, are things like, if we're talking about some crime scene, for example, it'd be these basic things, who was present, where were they located in the scene, how did they move around, was there some particular object used as a weapon, who used it, was somebody injured, what damage was caused to any property, those sorts of things. Those are basic empirical facts that you can gather, we might say through like a scientific study. Or just simple observation of the scene itself. But when we're talking about ethical judgments, that's sort of layered on top of the physical facts. So, for example, what harm was done? We might think that that's a physical question, right? Was somebody injured? But when we call it harm, that's a value judgment about that injury or about that damage that was done. And so that brings us into the realm of ethics. Was what happened, was it accidental or was it purposeful? That's getting more into a judgment. What was the motivation? Was it a good motivation or a bad motivation? Again, good or bad, that's an ethical judgment. Was what happened justified? Especially if a weapon was used or just some object was used as a weapon, was the use of that thing justified? Whether something is justified or not, well, that's a judgment call. You can't do measurements on the scene, a physical measurement to decide whether something is justified. Same thing with negligence. Was somebody negligent in their actions? That's a judgment call. You can't just simply measure that. Same thing with praise or blame. Are we going to say that somebody did a really morally good thing, an ethically good thing, or an ethically bad thing? Well, that's a judgment. There are no measuring sticks. There's no scales that we can use to physically measure such things. So that's one of the difficulties with ethics, that there's, and why there's a lot of disagreement and a lot of debate over even some relatively basic things in ethics, because it's not like science where you can just sort of straightforwardly measure things and settle a dispute through very simple measurement and recording of basic physical facts like that. Okay, so metaethics, which we're already sort of doing, is one of the three branches, very broadly speaking, of ethics. So metaethics is concerned with where does ethics come from? What is the actual basis for these ethical judgments that we're making? How do we decide what's good and bad, what's right and wrong? Then an ethical theory is a guideline, a set of guidelines or some procedure that we work through in order to decide what's the morally or ethically correct thing to be doing. And then applied ethics, as the term seems to indicate, is when we apply an ethical theory to a particular situation. So for example, we might wonder whether capital punishment for very horrible crimes, whether that's justified punishment or not. Well, it depends on the ethical theory, perhaps. We take an ethical theory and we apply it to that specific circumstance, that particular question, and we work through it and see what answer the ethical theory gives us. Okay, so this is, of course, focusing just on metaethics for this presentation. So here's some candidate things that might be the basis for ethical judgments, and in fact, frequently are the basis for people's ethical judgments, but we'll handle each of these in turn to decide which of these is probably the way that philosophy wants to go. How does philosophy approach metaethics? So first of all, emotions. Let's look at that. Well, certainly emotions help us to see what's important. When we have an emotional reaction, positive reaction or a negative reaction, that's an indication that something important is in front of us, and it can certainly motivate us to action, and frequently does. You can understand something intellectually, but that doesn't automatically mean you're going to do something about it. It's usually only once your emotions are engaged that you actually move forward and actually do something to help a situation or to stop something from happening or to cause something to happen. But there's problems there, of course. Our emotions are very inconsistent and can be contradictory. They're sort of all over the place. One day we can feel one way, the next day we feel a different way. So we might be motivated to act one day, but not motivated to act another day. And when we're talking about a good system of ethics, we want that to be consistent. We want it to sort of give us roughly the same answer every time that we consult it about a particular topic. And also emotions can lead us to immoral actions. We can feel very angry about something or just sort of have some strong negative reaction and we lash out based on those emotions, and then later on, once we've cooled down, we realize, oh boy, I never should have done that. That was wrong and I need to apologize or I need to make amends somehow. So just basing ethics on emotions, that's maybe like a very good rough and ready starting point, but that can't be the whole story. We have to base it on much more than just emotion. How about legal codes? You frequently might hear people say that, why is something bad? Well, because it's against the law. Or why is something morally permissible? That it is, why are we morally allowed to do something? Well, that's because it's legal. It's legal to do that thing. So some positive aspects of that is that, well, the laws are usually clear, right? There's some famous ambiguity, which is what the courts and the Supreme Court in particular is about, to try to clarify what the law is actually saying. But by and large, the laws are clear. Either something is legal or it's not. Then, of course, the threat of punishment, legal sanctions or legal repercussions of some kind can certainly provide motivation for following those laws. But there's some very serious problems with using just simply the legal codes as the basis for our ethical understanding. Because, of course, there's immoral laws, right? We can point to lots of examples through history of laws that said that we are required to do something or that we're not allowed to do something, but those laws are giving us immoral guidance. Some really famous ones would be Jim Crow laws, that is, laws that were enforcing segregation. Those are widely acknowledged to be immoral, but while those laws were in place, those were the legal codes. So people might say, well, why is it ethical to maintain segregation? Because that's the law, and that's the way we do it, and that's it. And so they also might outlaw things that we should be doing. You could probably think of a variety of examples there as well. And then there's some things that we think are immoral, but we don't really want our legal codes to become involved. So for example, just simply being a jerk, right? Just not being nice to people, being rude. Those are ethical questions. Maybe they're not really gigantic ethical questions, but they're ethical. We would say it's morally good to be nice to people, to speak pleasantly to people. But we don't necessarily want to enshrine those in our legal codes. We don't want to have legal enforcement, for example, of holding the door open for somebody or responding when somebody says hello. It's nice to do that. Maybe we might say it's morally good to respond when somebody greets you, but we don't want to say it's against the law. So clearly ethics, morality is much, much more than just the legal codes. Hopefully the legal codes follow our ethics rather than our ethics following the legal codes. Okay, next one. So religion, this is a very, very common basis for people's moral understanding and our ethical judgments. In philosophy, this is sometimes referred to as divine command, right? So there's some divine being that has issued commandments or some guidelines, and we're supposed to follow those, and those are the sole basis for morality, for what's right and wrong and what's good and bad. So similar things here to the legal codes, actually. The laws, by and large, might be clear, right? The 10 Commandments, they're fairly straightforward. But famously, there's some vagaries associated with what a particular religion is telling you to do or telling you to not do. And then, depending on the religion, there might be some fairly strong motivation, especially if we're talking about consequences in an eternal afterlife. That can be very strong motivation for doing the right thing. So there's some good aspects, perhaps, about using religion as the basis for our ethics. But famously, also, there are some potential problems with using religion as the basis for ethics. So probably the most obvious one is that there are multiple religions with contradictory moral codes associated with them. So we would first have to establish which is the correct religion. If we want to establish what is the correct system of ethics that everybody should be following, we would first have to establish what's the correct religion, and then figure out what that religion's moral codes are, and then we follow those moral codes. Well, it's famously pretty much impossible to establish which is the correct religion, so that seems kind of hopeless as a system of ethics that can apply to everybody. And as I put here in parentheses, this can lead to what we call cultural relativism, where ethics, instead of having one system of ethics that applies to everybody, we have all these little pockets of ethical systems that apply regionally, apply to different cultures or to different religions or to different societies. Then even within the single religion, there can be multiple interpretations. There's sort of this very strict conservative interpretations, then there's sort of the more modern, more liberal interpretations, and all these different sects within a religion that sort of follows subtly or perhaps very dramatically different moral codes. And that's famously difficult, maybe impossible to sort out in any systematic way. Then also, the other thing is that, what about the atheists, right? The idea here would be that if somebody is an atheist and we're basing all of our ethical codes on religion, well then the atheist has no reason to be ethical, no reason to be moral. And we sometimes hear people talk this way, that they are very worried when they hear about somebody being an atheist, because then they worry that that person has no reason to follow ethical guidelines whatsoever. It's a very interesting attitude. Okay, so there's also this really famous episode from Plato's work describing the dialogues involving Socrates, and it's called the Euthyphro dilemma. And so this is one of the people, Euthyphro, was one of the people that Socrates talked to and sort of twisted into knots and showed that he didn't really understand his own beliefs. And so without going into sort of all the details of exactly how Socrates did that, I'll kind of give you the quick summary of this dilemma. So the idea is that Socrates asks this difficult question: are right actions right only because of divine command, or are those actions commanded because they are right? The idea is that somebody is following the divine commandments, right? Doing what he believes the gods, remember this is ancient Greece, doing what he believed the gods commanded of him. And so therefore he believes he's doing the right thing. So now he's faced with this dilemma, and he's got to answer one of this question here. So we've got two options. The first option says that right actions are right only because of divine commands. Why is it wrong, for example, to murder? Why is it wrong to ignore the holy days and follow the proper rituals on those holy days? It's wrong because the gods have demanded us and have commanded us to do those things. And so failing to do them is morally wrong. Well, what's the problem here? Well, the problem is that this makes ethics seem kind of arbitrary. Right? If the only reason, the absolute only reason why some things are right and other things are wrong is because that some divine being said so, well, then it's just up to whatever that divine being wants to say. The rules could have been very different. In fact, a dramatic example could be that a divine being could say, you should lie. That's the right thing to do. I command that everybody lie all the time. Well, then lying would be the morally correct thing to do. Or stealing, or murder, or any of the other standard things that are uncontroversially bad. If the only reason those things are bad is because a divine being said they're bad, well, what if the divine being said that they were good? Then those things would be good. The divine being could, in fact, change their mind and switch them to being good now. And then we'd have to do all these things that we thought were bad because now that's the good thing to do. Okay, how about option number 2 then? Those commands were issued because they're right. You know, why did the divine being tell us that stealing is bad, murder is bad, lying is bad, and all of the rest? Well, it's because those things are right. That maybe makes a little bit more sense, but that's then now a further problem for divine command theory, because now this implies that there's this independent source of ethics, and that the divine being is simply consulting that other source, or consulting sort of that other truth, that reality about ethics, and then simply informing us as to what's right and wrong. And if that's the case, well, then it's at least possible that we could figure out what's right and wrong and good and bad ourselves. That we could figure out what those reasons are. You know, why did this divine being tell us that murder is bad? Well, we could figure that out for ourselves and come to the conclusion that murder is bad without the divine being telling us so. And in fact, this is what atheists end up doing, right? Atheists are no morally worse than religious people. They're maybe no morally better either, but they're no morally worse on average than a religious person. And that's because the atheist recognizes what's right and wrong and good and bad without having to consult the divine being. So this is sort of the deeper problem, sort of a famous philosophical problem with what's called divine command theory, basing our morality simply on religion. Okay, so not surprisingly, philosophers would prefer that we base our system of ethics on rationality. Really thinking through these issues and discussing them with our colleagues and getting a debate going and coming to what we consider to be the most justified basis for ethics. How do we do this? Well, we analyze the nature of good and bad. What is it to analyze? Well, we think really hard about it. And like I said, we discuss it with our colleagues and we have debates and we try to justify our beliefs and we accept criticism and maybe we adjust our beliefs based on that criticism and we come to some kind of consensus as to what's really going on here. And we do that to figure out what good and bad really are, what the sources of value are, positive value and negative value. And then we try to develop some kind of a consistent, defensible theory based on what we've figured out are good and bad, what's right and wrong, what's valuable and not valuable. And then we apply that theory to real life situations. Okay, so since this is the meta-ethics level, we're going to do just the first couple here, right? Analyze the nature of good and bad and identify sources of value and disvalue, and sort of at least show how that can start to lead to an ethical theory. So something is good or something is valuable when we want it to, when it's something that we actually want. We want to pursue it, we want to maximize it, we want to preserve it, preferably for its own sake, right? And that's what it means to be intrinsically valuable. Something is intrinsically valuable when it's good or it's valuable in and of itself, for its own sake. It's the end goal. We're not trying to get it in order to get something else. We're getting it just because it is good. Whereas something is bad, it's bad in and of itself. That just that thing all on its own, it's just a bad thing. So it's got negative intrinsic value. On the other hand, something is extrinsically valuable or extrinsically good when it leads to intrinsic value in some way or another. As I have here in the parentheses, money is sort of the classic example. Money by itself, just currency sitting here on the table, like why would that be good? Why is that valuable in and of itself? It's just some, physical object, who cares? Money is only valuable insofar as it helps us to get on the way towards obtaining something that actually has intrinsic value, something that's valuable in and of itself. Otherwise, who cares about money? In fact, it's sort of a huge mistake that people make when they think of money as being intrinsically valuable, and they spend all this time just gathering money just for itself, for its own sake, and they never really use that money to achieve or to maximize or pursue something that has intrinsic value, and they are left sort of without any real value. They're just left with a big pile of money. Okay. So here's the simplest, most famous examples of things that are intrinsically valuable, both positive and negative. So intrinsically positively valuable and intrinsically negatively valuable. So intrinsically bad, happiness and suffering. So let's start with happiness. How do we know that happiness is intrinsically good? Well, this is perhaps the easiest, most uncontroversial example, because it just doesn't make sense to think of happiness as anything other than a positive. You know, forget about why you're happy, where the happiness is coming from, what the happiness is going to lead to. Just think for a bit about the feeling of happiness, just the pure feeling of happiness itself. It just is a positive thing. It's nice, you know, it just is a good thing. It doesn't make sense to think of that just pure feeling of happiness itself as a negative thing. Now, if it leads to something bad, that's a different story. But if just the happiness itself, it just is a positive feeling. It's not neutral, it's not bad, it's positive. And on the other hand, suffering. Forget about where the suffering came from, what the suffering might lead to. It might help you to learn something or to better yourself somehow, but forget about all that for now. Just focus on the feeling of suffering all by itself. It just is a negative thing. Like I said, it might lead to something good, but don't worry about that. Just the feeling of suffering itself is just a negative. It just feels bad, right? And so if somebody were to ask you, well, what's so great about happiness? You might wonder whether they've ever really felt happiness, right? Because if you felt it, you just know that it's good. Same thing with suffering in the other direction. If somebody asks, well, what's so bad about suffering? You might wonder whether they've actually ever felt suffering, because if you feel it, it feels bad, right? And so happiness is intrinsically good, it's intrinsically valuable. Suffering is intrinsically bad. So let's sort of move on towards building up at least some basic starting point for ethics then. We're already on our way, but we've got a little bit more work to do. So most people, after thinking through sort of the intrinsic goodness of happiness and the intrinsic badness of suffering, they would agree with this statement. I care about my own happiness and suffering. I want to be happy and I want to avoid suffering. Most people seem like they're most normal, regular people are going to accept that kind of claim. But think now about sort of the selfish person, right? Somebody who just, for whatever reason, just doesn't care about other people. That's the difficult person to bring along with us here when we're trying to establish a fundamental foundation for ethics. They might say, I only care about my own happiness and suffering, and I have no reason to take other people's happiness and suffering into account. What do we do about that? How do we convince them that they're wrong? So, like I said sort of at the beginning of this, that's not a scientific question. That's a philosophical question, an ethical question. We can't show them the results of some experiment or some measurement that convinces them that they should care about other people. So let's look at a little bit of an argument here, right? Some reasons why maybe they should care about other people's happiness and suffering. So let's start with something that they would accept. I believe that my own happiness is intrinsically good and my own suffering is intrinsically bad. Even the selfish person is going to agree with that, what we would think, right? And they might further agree that it's wrong to cause me to suffer when I don't want to suffer. And it's right to cause me to be happy when I want it, right? It's a good thing. I'm glad when people make me happy when I want to be happy. And I'm unhappy, right? I'm displeased, I'm angry when people make me suffer when I don't want to suffer, which is most of the time. Okay, so here's then the move that the philosophers can make to show that even the very selfish person should care about other people's happiness and suffering. It turns out, and maybe this is obvious, but there just is no morally relevant, non-arbitrary difference between my happiness and suffering and other people's happiness and suffering. If I acknowledge that other people are capable of feeling happiness and they're capable of feeling suffering, I have to acknowledge that their happiness is not in any relevant way different than my happiness. Happiness is happiness. You know, their consciousness and their subjective feeling of that might be a little bit different. It's hard to really say. It's hard to get into other people's minds, but just the happiness itself, it doesn't seem like there's a morally relevant difference between my happiness and your happiness. It's just happiness that's being felt. And same with suffering. There's no morally relevant difference between my suffering and your suffering. Suffering is suffering, right? Again, there might be some subtle subjective differences between your perception of suffering and my perception of suffering in a given situation, but just suffering is suffering. It's morally the same for everybody. So if your happiness and suffering matters, then other people's happiness and suffering matters. Because if your happiness and suffering matters, then just happiness and suffering matters in general. And if other people are feeling it, then it matters when they feel it as well. It's not just all about you. Okay, so just to kind of spell that out, that conclusion out in a slightly more detail, and using sort of the terminology that we used before, it's wrong to cause them to suffer. It's wrong to cause other people to suffer when they don't want to suffer. And it's right to cause them to be happy when they want to be happy. So there's a whole lot more that can be said here. There's lots of debate over this, but nevertheless, this is sort of a basic way to get ethics off the ground, right? And at least to get sort of people to acknowledge that ethics is important and that they should follow it in their own lives, and they should take other people's feelings, other people's happiness and suffering into account. And of course, this isn't just about happiness and suffering. We could construct a very similar argument using, instead of happiness and suffering, we could use rights or freedom or duties, those sorts of things. These are other elements of ethics that people talk about a lot. This is just one basis for ethical judgments. There are others, but this is kind of the most straightforward, I think the easiest to understand basis for ethics. Just a real quick overview of some other general positions on ethics, some general sort of approaches to metaethics that you might see. So there's realism, relativism, and nihilism. So let's just take a real quick look at each of those. So realism is kind of what I've been talking about so far. That is that there's a system of ethics that should apply to everybody, and that there are ethical facts. These are objective. They are true, right? So if I say killing someone for no reason is wrong, that's just true. That's a statement of ethics. It's not a statement of science or anything like that. It's a statement of ethics. And the realist is going to say, this is a true statement, and that truth applies to everybody. On the other hand, there's relativism. Now, a relativist about ethics will also acknowledge that there's truths in ethics, that there's ethical facts, but the relativist disagrees about them being objective. The relativist thinks that they are subjective, or that they are relative to, perhaps relative to a society, or relative to a culture, or relative to a religion, so that there can be different kinds of ethical truths depending on what group you belong to. So the ethical relativist might say something like this: what is ethically wrong for me may not be ethically wrong for somebody else. You know, somebody else that's in a different group than me, a different religion, or a different culture than me. Okay, here's the more dramatic one. The nihilist, the ethical nihilist, says that there's just no ethical facts of any kind. They just deny it completely. This is a lot of modern ethicists find this a bit of a puzzling viewpoint, right? That the nihilist would say that nothing is ethically right or wrong. You know, killing, stealing, assault, like all these horrible things that we think of, there's nothing right or wrong about them. Right and wrong just doesn't exist, according to the nihilist, which seems like a pretty exhausting viewpoint. But those are the quick overview of the 3 general viewpoints on metaethics. And so I think I will go ahead and stop there. Thanks for tuning in.